Hello, Dr. Coyne.
Hello, thank you so much for speaking with me.
Thank you for speaking with me. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Chris Coyne. I am a professor of economics at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia, in the United States. And I am also the associate director of the F.A. Hayek program for advanced study in philosophy, politics, and economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University.
And you're also the author of a new book.
Yes, How to Run Wars is the main title, a confidential playbook for the national security elite. That's the full title.
When I opened your book, it immediately reminded me of a book I have read decades ago, which was written decades before that. I don't know if you have heard of Karel Čapek's Apocryphal Tales.
I have heard of it. I have not looked at it.
It's an amazing book. It, in some respects, it anticipates Monty Python. By the way, Karel Čapek was the same guy who coined the word robot.
Oh, all right.
In one of his plays, this word appears for the first time. But in particular, it reminded me of a chapter of his book. This imaginary letter that Alexander the Great writes to his former tutor Aristotle. And it's amazing because he had captured something about all these warmongers in history just in a few short pages. So Alexander begins to explain that first he had to take some part of Greece because otherwise there will be problems. And when he secured this part of Greece, his border was not secured because he had a new border now. So he had to invade some additional province to add it as well. And then, but he explains all these things. At first, it sounds rational, as though he is not a warmonger, he is not power hungry. He's just doing whatever is necessary, politically necessary. So he is just a rational politician. And then there is another province, and now he is unable to this power, which is hostile. So he has to take this as well. And it begins to look more and more outrageous when you read on and on, more and more absurd. Eventually, he is securing India, so that Macedonia, or Macedon, I'm not sure of the pronunciation in English, could be secured. So eventually he fights in India to protect the Macedonian interests. And that's not all. This is just the beginning. Because now that most of his domain is in Asia, he has to inevitably, to appeal to his new subjects, he has to proclaim himself a god and to adopt some of the customs there. And these customs look repugnant to his Greek subjects, but it's a political necessity. It has to be done. So you see how one thing follows to the next and to the next. And eventually he ends the letter to Aristotle asking him to help him proclaim himself God even in Greece, because it's a political necessity. It has to be done. And this was the impression that I was left when I was reading you mocking those people who always find rationalizations to their power-hungry schemes that never end and that are increasingly absurd and out of proportion.
Yeah, well, thank you for letting me know about that. From your summary, I'm going to have to seek it out after our conversation's done, because it sounds fascinating, and you're exactly right. Very much in line with my co-author and my perspective of what we're trying to do, which is to highlight to readers what war making requires and the absurdity of it in many cases. And the style of the book, as you got at in your comments, accurately so, is satirical in nature. It's the first time I've written in that style in an attempt to communicate with readers. A lot of my prior work has been on issues of war and foreign policy, but from a more kind of serious academic type tone and perspective. But that's kind of the point of it. And that's the beauty of satire, of course, as a style. It asks the reader and pushes the reader to think about beliefs and social practices and norms that are either taken for granted or viewed as completely rational and acceptable, and points out the tensions and oftentimes absurdities of them. And so if someone walks away from the book recognizing that, Abby Hall and I, my co-author, we'd be quite happy.
Yeah, you have achieved that.
Oh, very happy to hear it.
I noticed something else when I read history, that the more you get yourself distanced from historically from some war, the more pointless this war begins to look. When people are embroiled into it, they're convinced that there is no other way. But when time passes and the last veterans die eventually, and it's not so emotional, everything, and people tend to forget, then you begin to realize that, yes, there was another way, and there was a better way. And what we did actually was pointless. And all these people ultimately died for nothing, as cruel as this sounds.
Well, it's true. It's true. And that needs to be discussed and recognized, because while one way to hear what you just said is as being cruel, another is that it's cruel to ignore that point, that possibility, because human lives are at stake. And so, certainly I think you can envision scenarios where certain threats or invaders or people doing wrong to you requires pushback. Certainly at the individual level, we can think of scenarios like that. But one of the things that worries Abby and I is that way of thinking, that we need to push back against threats and stop threats and proactively stop threats, has become pushed to the forefront, where now everything, certainly the way U.S. government policymakers talk about the world, is there's threats everywhere. And as you correctly noted, the standard way of responding to those threats is, well, we need to use force, either force or the threat thereof, to deter threats, with very little regard for the point you just raised, the recognition that there's other ways to do things, and that if we just think about it, many of these wars are senseless. They don't accomplish what you say they're going to accomplish. And even if they do, they tend to perpetuate, in a violent and kind of cyclical way, further conflicts and problems.
Yes, we have to protect the Macedonian interests in India.
That's right. That's right.
We have to secure the Macedonian border in India. The Macedonian border with India. Eventually, he had a border with India, yes.
Yes, that's right.
I'm also reminded of Professor Niall Ferguson's The Pity of War, where he makes the case that British involvement in World War I actually made the war much bloodier. So I'm getting back to what I was saying, that not only these people died for nothing, they actually died to make the world a worse place. And then there are these books on World War II, mostly by Russian authors, and unfortunately most of them are not published in the West, so the Western public is not familiar. Books by authors like Viktor Suvorov, Mark Solonin, Vladimir Beshanov, and Sokolov, and others, who demonstrate that actually the World War II to a large extent was instigated by the Soviet Union, and that the British and later the American involvement was counterproductive, because instead of letting those two totalitarian monsters, the National Socialist monster and the Soviets, the monster of the Soviet socialism, to kill each other, like, by the way, Truman proposed at the beginning. He was just a senator at the time. He was not the president yet. Instead of letting them kill each other, they put their weight on one of the sides of the conflict and made things worse, because the result was that the Soviet Union could emerge out of the war relatively unscathed. So they basically, the British politicians wasted British blood and British treasure, and so did the American politicians, in order to save Soviet blood and Soviet treasure.
That's right.
And this led to the Cold War, because now they had another adversary which was even larger and even more brutal than the Nazi adversary. And I try to think of a war that was a good war in the 20th century. And I could come with only two examples out of so many wars. I mean, the 20th century is full of wars. I could think of the Falklands War, because British territory was invaded. So it was not just a matter of protecting your own country, but actually a matter of protecting the rules of the international public law. And also it was relatively not bloody, just a few thousand deaths, which is not bloody by the standards of the 20th century. And the Korean War, because again, it was there was a UN a decision of the Security Council that authorized it. And apart from those two conflicts, I cannot find any good war. All wars made the world a worse place. All these involvements of the British Empire and the United States, they were not just pointless, they were actually counterproductive. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yeah. I mean, even Korean War, for instance, certainly it was authorized, but I wonder on net if, again, part of what makes this so hard for all these cases is counterfactuals, or what would have happened absent the way things unfolded. But I wonder if there were alternatives to that as well. I'm not sure. Maybe there weren't. And part of this then, I think, is how one defines a good war. And that of course is a big question, one that ethicists and just war theorists have wrestled with for long periods of time. I don't know if it's being approved by either an international organization or a government that makes it good, or some end beyond that. I'm not sure. So I don't want to push back on what you're saying in any way, meaning that I certainly see what you're saying. But even in the case of the Korean War, I think one perhaps could make an argument that there are alternatives. I think for a lot of wars, perhaps most of them, there are almost always alternative means of dealing with the dispute. Now, I recognize there are consequences of choosing that action, meaning the nonviolent or non-warring action. But if that is our standard, and that is one of the aspects of just war theory, that other means to resolve the conflict have been exhausted, then our bar should be quite high. And that's part of the reason my kind of default position is one of being highly skeptical of war making when political leaders say it. And of course, once you start looking at the incentives that political leaders face throughout human history, war making serves certain interests quite well. It serves them well because they get the benefits, but they're able to offload significant portions of the costs onto members of both the domestic populace, but oftentimes foreigners as well. And oftentimes the most vulnerable people in foreign lands incur the harshest of the costs of war making. And so that requires, to my way of thinking, the proponents of any single instance of war to meet an extremely high barrier or benchmark of evidence. And certainly, to your original point, there are very few wars that meet that.
Could the criterion be if we're invaded, if we're defending our own territory?
Perhaps, but even that gets a little tricky, I think, because what does it mean to be invaded?
Well, foreign army, you're an American, foreign army on U.S. territory.
Sure. So I could certainly see that being a clear criteria, but then we run into challenging issues of things like, if you just look at the last 20 some odd years in the United States with the war on terror, which is very similar to the Cold War. You know, one of the problems with the Cold War is that you're fighting an ideology. So there's a country that you're fighting against, but it's also we need to stop the spread of communism. That's the kind of language, which of course led to a whole host of proxy wars and other interventions. The war on terror is similar from the standpoint of, well, we need to stop terrorists. Well, who's a terrorist? Well, that depends who you ask. And in some cases, it's very clear who the terrorists are. In other cases, it's not so clear. And so again, I think if a foreign army invaded, very clear cut, then yes, you have a justification for pushing back against that. But then that is pure defense. That's defense. What has happened, at least from my perspective, and I'll focus on the United States since it's what the book is focused on, but also I know it the best, but it's also the most dominant military force in the world today. Defense, that word means very little now, because if you look at what falls under the purview of defense, much of it is offensive. It is forward projecting. It is broadcasting force outside U.S. borders, well beyond the hypothetical you and I are discussing of an invading army. So I would certainly take that as a benchmark happily, even recognizing that there might be some gray areas, because that would be quite radical to what the United States government does right now.
This, by the way, was the point of Karel Čapek, because when you read this funny imaginary letter, apocryphal letter, you see that according to Alexander the Great, he is not a conqueror. He only defends Macedonia. he never undertakes any aggression, any offense. He only defends.
That's right. And that's the, you know, we have a chapter early in the book about rhetoric and convincing people that you're always on the good, you're the good side. And that's the rhetoric. Exactly what you just said. You said it jokingly because it's absurd.
Well,
but that's the rhetoric.
Karel Čapek did.
Right. Yeah, right. But
he wrote it in the 30s before I was even born.
Yep. And it's really true. We're the good. What we do is defending democracy or liberty or freedom or our interests. But once you take that view, then you can justify anything and everything you want. And that's the problem that we face today, certainly in the United States. And most people don't question it. You know, as far as government policies go, as far as different ideological perspectives go, foreign policy is one of these issues where it's not that there's perfect harmony and agreement, but there is harmony and agreement over the fact that it is widely believed, both in people's belief systems, but also in terms of resource flows, that the United States government needs to be everywhere and always projecting its power around the world, and that it is the source of order and protection of freedom and democracy around the world. And to my way of thinking, that just doesn't make sense. It collapses amongst itself, the underlying logic, once you realize what's required to actually do that.
Okay, but let's come with another scenario, which is real, by the way, from history again. After World War II, there are, again, new studies that have made the case that Stalin was serious about taking over the rest of Europe after 1945. There is the excellent book of Krzysztof Zakuretsky, with a lot of documentation, a very thick volume, but unfortunately not translated into English. Yeah. And there is another Russian author, Alexander Gogun, who also writes about the plans of Stalin to invade Western Europe. He was serious about that. And the only reason he stopped was that he knew that he will have to fight the Americans. The Soviet Union was powerful enough to take over Western Europe if it was not for the Americans. And not just the Americans, but the fact that, first of all, the Americans had the atomic bomb, and Stalin initially for a few years didn't have it. And even after he got the bomb in a few years, he didn't have means to deliver it. So he had to wait a few more years until the first intercontinental Soviet bombers were developed. And while he was postponing, eventually he died, or probably was killed by his inner circle. Now the point is, if at this point the Americans has said Europe is not our problem, we will only defend our territory. If the United States said that at this point, there is little doubt that Europe will be something like would have been something like a big North Korea. It would have been taken over, along with probably with the colonial possessions in Africa at the time and in Asia. So at this point, I find it hard to imagine how the world would have been saved from socialism if United States didn't project this power at this particular moment. What would be your comment on this?
Yeah, I mean, look, these are hard scenarios, and I don't say that to avoid the scenario. I say it to highlight that your point number one is well taken, but your point gets at a couple things. Number one, for many of these issues, there's no clear 0-1 black and white answer oftentimes. And that's okay. For a lot of complex issues, I think that's the case. But I also think it gets at something that we started with. So let's go back to the letter that you started with of I had to do one thing and then I had to do another thing. And in the book, we refer to them as tripwires, that an intervention over here sets up a tripwire. And once that's set off, then you have to do this in response, but that sets up two new tripwires.
Increasingly drawn into going further and further and committing more and more aggressions.
Right. So one response to that is, yeah, that's just how the world is, and that's how it's going to be, precisely for the reason, the scenario you raise, which is a series of events led to the rise of Stalin. Some of those were due to prior decisions regarding foreign policy by the United States and others. And then what do you do once that person's in power? So given that, do you step away or intervene more? Now, let's say, part of the challenge, by the way, is we're always, and you mentioned this earlier, I think correctly so, we're looking back, of course, and now we have access to time to reflect. We have access to historians doing wonderful work in critically analyzing both documents and just viewing history differently through time to offer different perspectives. And so hindsight's 2020, as they say, or closer to 2020 than in the moment of choice. And so the challenge is this. Well, there's multiple challenges. How do you identify genuine threats of the type you've highlighted in real time while this is ongoing? How do you identify those threats? Because ideally, you'd only want to respond to the Stalins of the world. You wouldn't want to respond to all the other supposed threats, which are not really threats.
To the Saddam Husseins of the world.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right. Exactly. And then if you're going to respond to the Stalin, so step one is separating the legitimate from the illegitimate. And then number two, is it possible to respond to the legitimate without undermining the very foundations of a liberal society? And these are really big challenges. And part of what's baked into arguments for intervention is they assume that the intervention is going to stop something bad from happening, which may or may not happen, but let's presume it does, but also that you can maintain a liberal set of institutions and beliefs while simultaneously doing that. And I'm skeptical of that, meaning that I think that carrying out a project of a global empire or global police requires you to act in an illiberal way, fundamentally. And I think it has permanent effects which undermine liberalism. Now, that might be the only way. That's kind of a pessimistic conclusion. Like, well, look, would you rather have Stalin take over, or would you rather have a U.S. system that has some semblance of freedom, but many semblances, not of socialism, but I would say of fascism in terms of the way it's organized economically, fascist economic system? And if that's our choice set, that's a tough one. But I like to think that there's a third alternative. And it might be too romantic or hopeful, but an alternative where war making is minimized. And part of that requires minimizing it on the front end. So can we think about ways of never letting things spiral out of control? But that requires breaking the cycle. Because once you get in the cycle, as your scenario points out, you just keep going. Stalin rises. Now we have to stop Stalin. Well, then what else happens? It just keeps going forever. There's no breaking point. It's unidirectional. The only way out of that is crisis, is imperial overstretch and the collapse of the system itself, which of course historically has happened to many great empires. Again, that's a very pessimistic read, but maybe it's an accurate one. History might be pessimistic and the future might be pessimistic. I'm more hopeful, but that might be where we are.
I share your views. I'm a libertarian myself. What's more, I wrote a book where I make the case that every attempt to plan the world always backfires, never
Yes.
leads to anything good. And the less we plan, the better. And that most of the problems we face are actually self-imposed or government-imposed problems. So I share your views, but still, I will let me be the devil's advocate here and continue with trying to find exceptions.
This is the fun part. Yeah.
Yes. So you mentioned Ukraine several times in the book. And some of the quotes you've put there. This is the interesting part, by the way, that because this letter of Alexander to Aristotle, that's wholly imaginary. He wrote it himself. He was unconstrained, except for some historical facts. But what you do is somewhat different because you use real quotes.
Yes.
People actually said these ridiculous things. That's not something a comedian came with.
No,
They actually said these things that you quote in the book, and you just build up on them. But Ukraine, why I'm mentioning Ukraine? Because there is one big but there, and that's that in 1994. United States struck a deal with Ukraine, according to which Ukraine would give up the nukes on its territory, and Ukraine kept its end of the bargain, and United States will take care of the security of Ukraine. So it's not just whether United States should put its finger in every pie all over the world. It's also the question, should United States keep its promises? Should international treaties be honored? Because if United States honors this treaty, United States is supposed to be involved in Ukraine. So what would be your position on that?
Yeah. So there's a couple of things. So again, your point is well taken. We have international agreements.
And by the way, excuse me for interrupting.
Please,
Ukraine is in this hot mess for a number of reasons, and one of the reasons is because it has no nukes.
Right.
So United States shares some responsibility. If I fully agree, it would have been better if United States did nothing, but United States should have thought of that back in 1994, not now.
Right. So a couple of things. So again, you raise an important point, which I appreciate you raising, because I do think these tensions and challenges you're raising is really fascinating intellectually, and they're important. They're important to, it's not just saying, I don't like war, therefore, well, let's talk about historical and real world scenarios. So I appreciate you pushing these. Certainly, we have an issue of international agreements and arrangements, but there's a couple of things I just want to highlight. One is that the way you set it up, which I understand what you're saying. So it's not like you're misstating the situation. Historically, the United States government has enforced those agreements that it wants to enforce and not enforced other agreements. That's number one. I'm not talking about Ukraine. I'm talking about generally. In other words, the United States government, if you look, invokes international and humanitarian law and treaties and agreements and the United Nations when it benefits them, or what those who are in charge want to accomplish, and they ignore it and push it by the wayside when it doesn't. And so that's something to think about in general, beyond Ukraine, which is, are they actually committed, and are there enforcement mechanisms in general? Now, here's the other thing. Certainly, the United States government in the mid-90s, as you mentioned, offered a security guarantee. Now, one thing to think about, and I'm not an expert on this, I've only read a little bit about it, so what I'm saying might be incomplete, if not wrong, and I fully admit that. When Ukraine gave up their nukes, my understanding is they were limited in their functionality to start with, meaning that the government of Ukraine didn't have the capability to launch them, but you know more than I.
That's correct. They didn't have the capability. The button was in Moscow. What's
Correct.
more, the way these intercontinental ballistic missiles were wired, they were meant to be used in a particular way to strike targets thousands of kilometers away. However, Ukraine could have easily rewired the nukes. Besides Ukraine, some of these components were manufactured on Ukrainian soil. So the Ukrainians had the experts, the Ukrainians had the facilities. And the hardest thing to obtain when it comes to nuclear weapons is the plutonium core and the other materials that undergo fusion or fission. Apart from that, the rest is trivial. For relatively technologically developed nation as Ukraine, it's trivial. So the Ukrainians could have easily used these nukes, although at the time they couldn't use them.
Interesting. So thank you for that context. That's very helpful. But even that aside, you're right. They gave them up. So then they have the guarantee. So then the question is, Russia invades. What do you do to provide that security? And now here's the fascinating question. What does security mean, and what's the end game? And so once you say we're going to provide you security, one government to another, and then something happens, you actually have to take steps. You have to provide content to what that means. And there's several things that suggest perhaps that there's other factors that are playing in other than purely the interests of ordinary Ukrainian citizens. What are some examples? One is there seems to be several points throughout the war, at least my reading. Again, please set me straight if you know more than I, which I'm sure you do on this topic. In my understanding, there were several instances where there was the possibility does not mean guarantee, of course, possibility of negotiations to end the conflict. Where those would have ended up, I don't know. But those possibilities were not embraced by members of the U.S. government because they wanted to continue the conflict for a variety of reasons. But in some case, I'm sorry, please.
Sorry to interrupt. These are rumors. We don't have anything. We don't know anything for sure. We haven't seen actual documents with signatures.
No, of course. And this goes back to the point earlier. How do you do this in real time? Not looking back 2 decades later, when in 2 decades there'll be books written and historians will have carefully scrutinized all this. So your point's well taken. We don't know. But we do know that there are members of U.S. Congress who have said publicly, this is great because it's going to wear down Russia. It's going to wear down their military, their economy, and we don't have to put any troops on the ground. The Ukrainians are fighting for us. So this is a cheap way of undermining Russia. Now, I'm not saying that's a widely held view amongst everyone in Washington, D.C., but to the extent that is the view, that's problematic because
I'm with you here. I totally agree. It's problematic to say the least, and I don't think that United States should be in business of wearing anybody down. My point is different, though. My point is, should United States keep its promises? Should international treaties be actually kept?
Right.
And I'm not talking about enforcement. I'm not talking about boots in the ground. I'm talking, let's say, about the fact that right now, for every shell the Ukrainians shoot at the Russians shoot back 5 shells.
Yes.
So should United States at least provide them with shells? Let's
But I'm trying to engage your question in the following way. You can't answer that question without looking at politics because it's all going to be filtered through the political system. So when someone, you can never, what I'm trying to say is you can have the agreement, but once the agreement is triggered, so the invasion happens and you need to provide security, what does that mean to provide security?
Well, unfortunately, the Budapest Memorandum is vague on this, doesn't say anything specific.
That's right. That's right. So then it's filled in through the political process. So you get, we want to drag this out. You get the Republicans holding up funding that's blocking funding, which eventually got passed in the past round to go to Ukraine. But that was a hot mess on the U.S. side in the political process. You can't escape these things. And so it's never as clear as saying, should the U.S. government enforce their promises? You can say yes, but then you always have to say the next step. Well, what does that mean in practice? Are they actually going to do it? And what does that look like? What does enforcing a promise look like? Again, the Biden administration, they've eased up on this through time. But remember, originally they were limiting the type of weapons, of course, because they wanted to limit what the Ukrainians could do in terms of going inside of Russia, in terms of targeting inside Russia. That's been eased through time. But that's another interesting question. Does providing security mean not just providing them shells, but which shells, what amount of shells, and then what authorization or approval do you give? And is it the right of the United States government to give them approval, or is that up to the Ukrainians to say, here's weapons, you defend yourself the way your government thinks you should defend yourself because you know better than us? But that's rarely how it works. The U.S. government has a variety of interests that it's pursuing, that's part of the reason I'm skeptical of the enterprise. Not that I'm skeptical of believe me, I like you, I'm a fan of contracts and promises. I think that's what makes the world go round, is us being fulfilling our promises to our fellow human beings. But I'm quite skeptical when government is involved, especially in the international space. Because even when that memorandum was signed in the 90s, no one could foresee what the world would look like in the 2000s. Just like no one can foresee what the world's going to look like in 2040. No one could foresee the rise of Donald Trump or Joe Biden stepping aside, or that's just in the last couple months with Biden. And so governments are not people. They're not individual people it's not like you and I entering into a contract and then me coming back to you 5 years later and saying, well, hey, we signed this contract that you would do X for me. These are entities that are governments that are supposed to represent other people, but the control of those governments is constantly shifting and changing. And it's a mix of political elites and private elites. And so that's why I don't think the simple, well, they have a promise, should they enforce it? Perhaps in some abstract sense, but in practice, I have very little faith in that happening. And maybe that's too cynical on my part. I recognize that. But I think we have a lot of evidence to support the point that governments tend to be very poor enforcing their agreements.
It just occurred to me that actually this Karel Čapek's tale really nicely aligns with the subject of your book, also because he not only goes into Alexander being drawn into new conflicts, but Alexander stifling the democracy back in Greece, again because of the war. He has to be proclaimed a god back in Greece. It just crossed my mind. This interconnectivity between making war and stifling freedom.
Yeah, I think this is an overlooked cost. And one way to view the book or our conversation, which is fascinating, is the book never offers a bright line rule, like here's when you engage in war and here's where you don't, because I don't think that exists in a way that you can just list it out like it's a recipe. Like you can talk about generalities, but when you move from those generalities to any real world circumstances, it gets really messy really quick, as I think parts of our conversation has made clear. But one of the things I hope listeners to this and readers will take away of the book, if they choose to read it, is that war has a lot of scene costs. That's the blood, treasure that's observable to the eye. But there are a lot of these unintended perverse consequences. There are a lot of overlooked costs. There are costs in terms of the erosion of norms and liberal values and political and economic institutions at home. Because, one of the things we point out in the book, this fits very nicely with your own work and your book on planning, is that war itself requires planning, but of course, war requires resources, which means the government is going to have to plan a significant chunk of economic activity in order to redirect by force resources from how they would have been used voluntarily into war making. And, at least in the United States, we were talking about the end of World War II and the Cold War. Part of that was the United States government readily adopted what was called a permanent war economy. Prior to that, the kind of standard view was, well, look, we need some very low level of defense spending in order to protect against invasion. And then when these wars occur, we're going to spike up spending on defense production, and then we're going to ratchet it down after the war ends. But the idea of the permanent war, I'm sorry, go ahead, Vladislav.
Sorry, the way the American founding fathers meant it to be.
Yes, exactly. And then what happened in the wake of World War II, at the rise of the Cold War and the U.S. taking on the role of the world's police, is now we need a permanent war economy. We need investment for innovation, for production. And this just took on a life of its own, and it's continued to this day. Now, whether people find that to be a positive or negative, that's up for discussion and debate. But I think it's an important thing to talk about. You look at what oftentimes is called the military-industrial complex, and people focus, I think, too narrowly on kind of the top military producers, the private producers. And they're important. This is the Boeings, the Northrop Grumman, the Raytheons of the world. Those are very big and important firms. But you very quickly, when you start looking into the military sector in the United States, realizes that its tentacles extend everywhere. You need office supplies, you need accountants, you need health insurance. All of these things become contracts with the military sector, which means they are subject to the rules, mandates, and dictates of the administrative state. And so the scope of this domestically is enormous. It's what I referred to it earlier as closer. It's not socialism. It's not the nationalization over the means of production. It's closer to a fascist economic system where you have private ownership over the means of production, but you have public-private partnerships with the government's role to be in charge of or place limits on private business in the name of the national interest. And that's much of what happens in the U.S. military sector. And so that's another cost we need to think about. Again, how you think about that cost is tough because it's not a monetary outlay. It's not like, we're spending however many millions or billions of dollars on this war or that war. It's not like foreign aid where you're sending aid to a country like we were talking about earlier with Ukraine. And so it gets quite tricky. But that's also important. Those are important costs not to ignore, I think.
Well, with Ukraine, my point was that the United States is supposed to help and send shells, not out of the goodness of its heart, but because it tricked Ukraine to give up its nukes. And there were voices at the time in Ukraine who were saying that's a stupid thing that we will do because Russia is next door. There were people in Ukraine who were afraid that this may happen someday. And they wanted to keep at least some of the nukes. But United States and Britain also.
And
so
Britain
I share
well.
Responsibility as a Brit, although I wasn't Brit at the time, but now I am, so I share responsibility. And Britain, they pressured Ukraine and they promised Ukraine security, and Ukraine decided eventually did this foolish move. I totally agree with your argument that it's not just the industrial complex, because you need extra taxation, you need more regulation, and you move further and further away from freedom. That's obvious. But by the way, the Soviet Union was most centralized exactly in the periods when it was preparing for war, when it was on war footing. And the totalitarian states, governments understand this very well. They're in perpetual warmongering state and in perpetual preparation for war, even if there is no war. And as George Orwell even had captured this very well in 1984, that the war is not meant to be won, the war is meant to be everlasting.
That's right.
And we see this in North Korea today. North Korea today is always on a war footing, always ready to invade its neighbor. And this doesn't necessarily mean that it will ever do that, but it needs to prepare, because by preparing, it could stifle dissent within. So I totally agree with this argument. But going back to Ukraine, you use the word enforce international treaties. I wouldn't use this word, first of all, because of the international public law. I still remember when my lecturer on international public law appeared the first day in the auditorium, his first words were, remember, there is nothing above government. There is no world government. United Nations is not a world government.
That's right.
So the problem with enforcement has always been there. But I was not talking about enforcement. I was talking about just because obviously nobody expects United States to go to war with Russia over Ukraine. I was just saying that the United States should at least send them shells, because the United States has the industrial capacity. By the way, the United States is not even a matter of money. United States still has this old Cold War stocks that it has to destroy anyway, and destroying them would cost money. So why, instead of destroying it, give it to the Ukrainians? Actually, the United States could even save money. What about that? Would you be okay with that?
Here's the challenge. And again, I fear that I'm making it sound like, I hate even having to say this but it's the way the world is, that if you push back against any of this or even critically think about it, you're pro-Russian. I mean, look, my own view is that governments are terrible universally to varying degrees.
I agree. I totally agree.
And that people should not invade other people. So I think Putin is terrible what he did. I think the Russian government with the invasion is terrible. I think killing innocent people is terrible. So I'm against it on both sides. Here's my skepticism with the sending the shells. It's unclear. It assumes that sending weapons and armaments to the Ukrainian government is going to end the conflict. And that is one possibility. I don't deny that possibility, but here's an alternative. An alternative is it prolongs the conflict and results in unnecessary deaths of innocent people. And I don't know which one of those pathways, because I can't foresee the future and all the various moving parts, is correct. But I want to know what the end game would be. So the US government sends shells. Let's say they sent more shells tomorrow. The Ukrainian government uses them against Russia. It imposes some kind of damage. And then my question would be, and then what? Does Russia say, okay, we're tapping out. You've defeated us. We can't go any further. Does Russia ramp up its offensive in retaliation? And then what happens? Does the US government have to send more weapons? I don't know. But that is my concern. My concern is once you head down that path without a clear, some people call it an off-ramp, some people call it an exit strategy, but just some kind of goal beyond ending the conflict, whatever that means in broad terms. Because, of course, even ending the conflict, does that mean Ukraine gets all of the occupied territory back? Or does it mean Russia gets to keep a portion of it, but not all of it? I don't know. These are, and it's not for me to decide. I don't think I don't think that's for a Westerner, an outsider to decide. I know other people disagree with that, but these are just some of the kind of issues I'm wrestling with in my head. And the reason I push back on it's just a matter of sending armaments or not.
I personally couldn't care less whether Ukraine has more territory or less territory. This doesn't affect the world or United States for that matter in one way or the other. But here's something I do care about. what's the message that this conflict will send? Because if Russia wins, the message is the international law does not matter, nukes do. And if this is the message, this message will not be lost on many governments all over the world, which will try to obtain nuclear weapons and which will never give up their nukes. So, because governments, just like individuals, react to incentives. And if this conflict is won by Russia, the incentive would be from now on to disregard the law and to obtain nukes. And if enough powers all over the world obtain nukes and this technology becomes widespread, it's a matter of time before some of these nukes are used in real war or are in the hands of terrorists. And then the next question is, if a terrorist organization has only one nuke or only two, would it use this one precious nuke to blow up the capital of Nigeria, or would it use to blow up the capital of the United States?
Yeah, these you're as prior, your concerns are well founded, and I understand where you're coming from. So no, I have no disagreement in terms of the thought experiment. I guess the issue though is this: what would Russia, and I don't know if there's a clear answer to this, so I'll put it on the table for conversation. What does Russia winning the war look like? Some people in the United States, at least, say that giving Russia any gains from the invasion. This goes back to my point about what should the distribution of land be, for instance. I've read people who argue that granting Russia any gains is victory for them because it shows that they can gain something by invading. So that's a very strong or high bar of victory from the standpoint of. I'm sorry, go ahead, please.
I'm sorry, I'm one of those people, although otherwise, apart from this issue with Ukraine, I'm totally with you, and I'm a libertarian, and I would have preferred if United States didn't get involved in Ukraine to begin with, because if United States didn't get involved back in 1994, now I would say it's not United States business. So yeah. Sorry to interrupt you. Please go on.
No. So I don't know.
You were saying that this is a very tall bar.
Yeah, well, it's tall because it means that defeating Russia here means not just pushing them out, but returning all of the land to Ukraine that has been that's currently occupied and controlled by Russia, and that's one view. Others say that defeating Russia is either that or some variant, but then ensuring that Russia will never do it again. So what does that mean? Could mean a whole variety of things. My point being that how you define victory here for both Russia and for Ukraine and for Western governments matters a great deal. It matters a great deal in terms of what that outcome is going to look like. And here's the challenge. You could make the argument that if it's so important to defeat Russia, that the U.S. should become even more involved in the war. But
not to defeat Russia. I just want this conflict to send a message like Margaret Thatcher did with the Falklands War, that crime does not pay.
Yes. And of course, doing that requires raising the cost, as you put it earlier with incentives. That's just a different way of repeating what you said correctly earlier. But oftentimes that requires hitting your opponent quite hard to send a credible signal, and that can be through sanctions, or even though I don't think sanctions work very well, others believe they do, or it can be through force.
They don't.
And so again, I guess the point is the challenge is, and no one has an answer to this, by the way. This isn't. There are issues with the libertarian philosophy, and we've highlighted some of them. Libertarianism is broad. So it doesn't offer us a clear answer of self-defense, of magnitude of restitution in terms of retribution. Sorry, I used the wrong word. Retribution when someone attacks you, like how far push back I can go. Those are open issues in libertarian political philosophy. And by the way, it's fascinating we're having this conversation, because if you look at classical liberals throughout history who are dealing with these issues of foreign affairs, they're wrestling with the same issues. So how do we deal with specific threats in the world? Can we rely on nation state governments, or do we have to set up international organizations? Some of them actually argued for global governments for precisely the reason you, and I think you referred to your law professor, raised earlier, that there's no one above government, right? Nation state governments. So then they said, well, maybe we should have some kind of global government. Of course, that just pushes it up a level. Who's above the global government to oversee and enforce things there? There's no one.
Well, this is why he started with this, because this is the main thing about international public law, that
Yep.
there is nobody to enforce it.
Yep. And so these are hard questions, and I don't have clear-cut answers, but a lot of people don't. Other schools of thought, other political philosophies, they don't have answers to it either. So in some sense, we're all kind of wrestling with these really big open questions. Again, my own view, subject to contestation, is that this goes back to where we started our conversation. More often than not, meddling with and engaging with and responding to threats with threats and violence just perpetuates it. Now, the challenge again, and I recognize it's a challenge. I recognize I'm not offering a clear-cut answer, and people can dismiss what I'm saying because of that if they find it unsatisfactory. How do you get out of this once you're in it? So now we're in a world where the United States government has its hands in everything, basically everything around the globe. It has a global military bootprint. That has created certain expectations, some of them formal. This goes back to your point about security agreements, some of them informal. So other governments have been acting based on certain expectations, whether formal or informal, based on past U.S. government activities and, in some cases, explicit promises. But those promises are grounded in global militarism and promises of militarism. And so if we're ever going to break out of this cycle, the question is, how do you do it without stepping back from those promises? That's a really hard challenge. The alternative is you perpetuate them.
Stop
What's
making
that?
promises. Stop making promises.
Yeah, of course. So that's one way to do it. That's forward looking. So from here on out, we're not making the promises, but the challenge is someone can always come back and say, well, the system has been set up with the expectation that you're going to provide security. I mean, think about, to your point about nuclear weapons. It's not just Ukraine. One of the arguments for kind of a nuclear umbrella, which is there's a few great powers that have nuclear weapons and then others are not going to need them because those few global powers will have them, is that those global powers will strategically use those nuclear weapons to deter others. And so the very system at a global level is set up where the United States government and others are responsible for providing that security. You brought up Neil Ferguson earlier. And, of course, his other books, he's written so many books, but his other books, one of them called Colossus, is based on this idea that, look, the British Empire provided global security and global public goods until they didn't. But now that is the task of the United States government. And the United States government needs to embrace that and provide those global public goods. And what is that? That's military, that's economic, that's monetary, and that's legal. And whether you agree with that or not we can debate that, of course. I'm skeptical.
I don't.
You don't agree with it. But that's a position. And that's a position people have. And they basically take the logic of public goods in economics domestically and apply it globally. But that's the kind of challenge we face. That's by we, I mean those of us who subscribe to whether you want to call it liberal or libertarian type political philosophy. But again, others face the same challenge. Every political philosophy runs into the certain challenges when it comes to foreign affairs and relationships between governments. And they have certain responses that are different than the ones we've been discussing, but ultimately they run into the same tensions and challenges.
I don't think that United States a priori owes anything to anybody.
You don't think they owe anything to anyone?
I don't think that United States a priori owes anything to anybody.
Okay, I follow you. Yep.
I think that United States could just say enough is enough. Save yourselves. May the chips fall where they may. we are out of here. None of our problem. I would be okay with this. The problem, like I said, with Ukraine several times, is that at first they engaged, and then they decided that they don't want to get involved, which is an inherently dishonest position. Because
Sure.
if you make a promise, you should keep this promise. At
Yep.
least provide shells. I mean, nobody is expecting United States to do the impossible, to go to war with Russia. Nobody wants that.
Well,
But
some
at
do, I
least,
think, but
but
yep.
at least it could give them shells. At least the shells that are left from the Cold War.
Now let me pose this as another scenario. The United States government occupied Afghanistan post 9/11, overthrew the government, claimed to be creating a new government, training a military and police force, and then they just upped and left. Does the U.S. government have an obligation to the people of Afghanistan to provide resources, security, a whole host of different things because they invaded and overthrew their regime and manipulated it? And if not, why not? Now that was an explicit commitment, but some people I've read have argued that it's an implicit agreement, that the state of affairs in Afghanistan is the result of past actions, which places a moral duty on members of the U.S. government to provide certain things to the people of Afghanistan.
Well, legally, I would argue that this is not the case with Afghanistan, because United States legally had the right to invade Afghanistan, because technically United States was Afghanistan committed aggression against United States. Now, this may sound weird to many listeners, but technically it is so, because there is one resolution of the United Nations from the 60s. I quote it in my book, I don't remember the number, which describes what aggression is. And it lists many scenarios like invading forces, blah, 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 all these obvious things that everybody thinks of, but also providing safe haven to those who attack your territory. And Afghanistan at the time provided safe haven to Osama bin Laden, who was the mastermind with his organization, and thus technically United States was Afghanistan committed aggression against United States. As weird as this may sound, technically it is so. So United States didn't commit aggression against Afghanistan by invading Afghanistan. Now, regarding the nation building, which was an incredibly stupid move, which was not, it was known from the beginning, but all in the know that it will never work, which would have never been undertaken. I cannot say anything about that. For me, an agreement is something that's on paper, not something that is implicit, because I'm a former lawyer and I think as a lawyer, I expect to see something on paper that is signed.
Yeah. So perhaps part of the challenge then
and there is no such thing when it comes to Afghanistan.
Sure. So there's a couple things. Maybe part of the issue then is that we're identifying is some gaps in international law, because like all kinds of laws, and tell me if you disagree with this, laws are what they are. That's true by definition, but here's what I mean by that. Meaning that there's always gaps in laws that need to be interpreted, but also you can have a law that in principle is immoral or legally allows for an immoral behavior, even though it is legal. And what do I mean by that? So you might say that under international law, the U.S. government was authorized to invade Afghanistan because Afghanistan engaged in aggression against the United States. But then the interesting question, I think, or one of the interesting questions is, well, which people in Afghanistan? It wasn't ordinary Afghan citizens.
It's always the people who represent the ordinary people, and that's the government.
Yes.
This is how the international law views these things.
Right. But then you have an invasion that was not just targeted against those that were governing it, meaning that you can envision a scenario in Afghanistan where the U.S. government simply relied on special operations forces to go after Osama bin Laden and his ilk. And that's, of course, ultimately how they ended up getting him without invading the country in its entirety. And so this is the point I'm making, which is the law itself says retaliation might be legitimate. Let's assume it was. But then what is retaliation? It's kind of like, what is security? It's such a broad concept that without further evaluation and discussion, which can avoid issues of ethics, which can avoid issues of practicality, political practicality, we can't add any content to. And that's the challenge, I think. So I don't know. By the way, tell me if I'm misremembering this, and if you know about it. My understanding was that the Bush administration was offered by the Taliban an arrangement where Osama bin Laden would be turned over not to the United States but to some neutral government because they were worried that Osama bin Laden would not be given a fair evaluation and trial by the United States government. I might be misremembering that, but I feel like that was the case. Then the Bush administration said,
I don't know.
no, we don't want that.
No, I mean, I don't know. I don't know.
Right. No, I follow you. But if I'm remembering that correctly, and I'd have to check, I fully recognize I might be misremembering it. Then again, this goes back to our point before, the point I tried to raise earlier, that there's oftentimes ways to avoid war and violence. We may not like them, but that is, we might say, I don't like that, so I still want to invade you. But there's almost always ways to avoid it. And that's, I think, for those of us who are skeptical of war making, we're always looking for those ways to do that, while fully recognizing all the challenges and tensions that we've been highlighting in our conversation.
Thank you very much for this conversation. It was interesting to me. I hope it will be interesting to the people who would watch it.
Yeah, I'm the same. I appreciate you taking the time and for raising these challenges, because for those who are listening, hopefully, even if they'll agree or disagree with certain things we said, but hopefully they'll recognize the nuances and challenge and tensions and think more about it. And that's the most we can hope for, I think.
Could you please tell us where people can obtain your book?
Sure. The book is called How to Run Wars, and it's available on Amazon in hardback form, in ebook or Kindle form, and in audiobook as well. And so hopefully people will find it of interest. And for those who do, thank you in advance for taking the time to read it or listen to it and to think about the issues that it raises. And thank you again for having me on to speak with you.
Thank you. See you later, Professor Coyne.
Take care now. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.